Hello and welcome to chapter 11 of Tin. So settle in, grab yourself a drink and a cookie and sit ready for the next chapter. The rain came down on Ironhaven. Jack had never seen anything like it. As they drove, it loomed ahead of them, a great big hump of tangled towers and houses and pylons and trees and hills, all sleek and black and shiny in the approaching gloom of the evening, and all of it made of metal. It was like the junk dumped in Absalom's junkyard, but junk which had found a pattern and purpose. "Who made it all?" asked Manda. "Mechanicals," said a grim-faced Estelle. Her look had darkened ever since she'd seen the first sign about a mile back. Flesh turn back. It had said. This one had been followed by others, all badly painted and scrawled, but with similar messages. No flesh here, flesh not welcome. Ironhaven was made by discards and deserters, continued Estelle. Back in the old days, there weren't any laws governing what people did with their mechanicals. They used to dump the old ones by the side of the road. Discards would just wander around until somebody either picked them up and used them or had them smelted down. Rob shivered. Estelle went on. Mechanicals did what they liked here and no one knew what to do with them. They started building homes and the town started to grow. Before the government could decide what to do, Cormier had moved in and proclaimed that Ironhaven was independent. They passed another sign. "Turn back now, flesh," it said. Estelle glared at it. Cormier banned all proper people from entering the town. "Why didn't the government just stop him?" asked Jack. Estelle shrugged. "Because he was Philip Cormier, the greatest engineer of them all. They didn't want to upset him." "Why's that?" asked Rob. Estelle looked at Rob. "Sometimes, Rob, when you have a temperamental child on your hands, the easiest thing to do is to give the child what they want." Rob frowned at this and scratched his chin. After a moment's contemplation, he nodded. As they drove closer to the town, the rain became heavier until it became an impenetrable grey wall, and the sound of it thrumming off the cab roof was so loud they had to shout to be heard above it. Jack marvelled even more at the town as they got closer. There were trees here, but they were made of metal. They had iron trunks and tin plate bark and copper plate leaves. The houses, all sharp and angular, were almost piled one on top of the other. And yet, looking at their construction and their placement, it all seemed to make sense to his eyes. It was as if the town, despite its artificial nature, had grown from the soil. He was distracted by Estelle bending her head low and moaning. He turned to her to see her rubbing her temples. "What's wrong, Estelle?" "Nothing. Just keep driving," she snapped. They drove on for a bit, but didn't see anybody until they arrived in a narrow street. "Stop here!" Estelle shouted. "I see someone." There was a figure walking across the road, long and spidery limbed. He turned to face the truck and Jack stopped a few feet in front of him. He looked at Estelle. She was rubbing her forehead now. "Everybody out," she said. They all clambered out of the truck and the watcher in the road loped towards them. Even with the sound of the rain, they could hear the clank of his limbs. Jack stepped towards him. "Excuse me, do you know where we can find Philip Cormier?" he asked. Jack could see the figure's long, mournful face and his large round eyes. With a sinking sensation, he realised the mechanical was addressing had no mouth. "It's a mute," said Estelle. The mute looked at them. His long legs were bowed and his back was hunched. His right hand was missing, and the rain plinked off his brass dome of a head. Nobody said anything, and the mute continued to look at them with his doleful eyes. "What's a mute, Estelle?" whispered Rob, without taking his eyes off their observer. "Mutes can't speak. They're used in factories or by people who prefer to have servants they don't have to listen to. I'm beginning to understand why." Jack shot her a look. He didn't appreciate the sarcasm, especially if it was directed at Rob, but Estelle wasn't paying any attention. She was too busy rubbing her temples again. Jack stepped towards the mute. "Cormier, do you know where he is?" The mute looked Jack up and down. His neck squeaked on its hinges. He slowly raised his right arm and pointed at a shack across the road. There was a soft orange glow coming from its interior. "He's in there," said Jack. The mute lowered its arm. It looked Jack up and down again and slowly shook its head. "But—" The mute raised its arm again and pointed towards the shack. "I think he wants us to go in there, Estelle," said Jack. "Fine." Estelle growled and she stomped towards the shack, splashing up water as she went. As they approached, they could see a tiny figure outside the shack. It was an old doll, no more than a foot tall. She was walking back and forth, a ragged, wet bonnet stuck to her head, and she wore an old, soiled pinafore. She was saying, "Mama," over and over again. She stopped for a moment and turned her head and looked at them. When she'd seen enough, she went straight back to marching back and forth and saying, "Mama." Estelle stepped towards the doorway of the shack. It wasn't much of a doorway, just a sheet of metal slanted at a precarious angle. Manda was gaping at a tree. She reached out and held a leaf between her thumb and forefinger. It was delicate and finely filigreed. "Ooh," she gasped. "It's beautiful." "Come away from there, Manda," said a scowling Estelle. Estelle banged on the door. Jack winced at the sound and her ferocity. He reckoned it was a bit more forceful than was required, but he was surprised when he heard a rather calm voice from within say, "Yes?" "We're looking for Cormier," said Estelle. There was no reply. "Can we come in?" she asked, looking exasperated. A boy poked his head out of the door so suddenly that they all flinched. Rob recoiled with such force that he had to spin his arms around to keep his balance, and it was only the gentle hand of an attentive gripper that stopped him falling into a puddle. "Did you know that the distance between John O'Groats and Land's End is 603 miles? Said the boy. They all just looked at him. He only had skin on the right side of his face, and what was left of it was peeling away. His head was scuffed and scraped, but his eyes were bright. "Yes," he smiled. "What?" said Jack. "You can come in." The boy stood aside and Gripper held the sheet of metal to one side so the others could squeeze in. Estelle told him to wait outside. She took a deep breath and stepped into the shack.